The coronavirus pandemic postponed the Summer Games for an entire year. But now, Tokyo 2020 is here. I'm Brendan Dunlop, and this is Tokyo Daily, the brand new Olympic show from the Toronto Star. Can you believe it? We're here. 11,324 athletes from more than 200 countries competing in 33 sports with 50 disciplines. That's 339 events in a pandemic. Getting to these games has been such an ordeal for athletes, for organizers, for everyone involved. Getting to and through Friday's opening ceremony, much the same. The ceremony director was fired on Thursday over a Holocaust joke that he made in 1998. The composer, a creative director, were forced to resign over offensive comments that they made. We really didn't know what the show was going to look like at all. We only just learned yesterday that Keith Urban and John Legend would be musical acts participating. We knew that the parade would be much smaller. Only 30 of the 371 Canadians competing marched. Maybe Tokyo just couldn't handle the full squad of Canadian tuxedos. The Canadian women's soccer team did a full hotel hallway parade. Check out their socials. Canadian men's rugby sevens player Nathan Hirayama and women's basketball captain Miranda Iam carried the Canadian flag into an empty 68,000-seat Olympic stadium. There were only a few dignitaries and international VIPs in attendance. After the year and a half we've had, it felt strange to watch an elaborate but scaled-down version of the opening ceremony with everyone in masks, except for Kyrgyzstan's Olympic team, who were the only ones to walk without. Tonga's shirtless flag bearer was a social media favorite again for the third straight games. And if you had Naomi Osaka in the office pool to be the one that would light the cauldron, you won your bet Friday morning. It was a symbolic moment and always a spectacle as the Japanese tennis star marched up the steps from Ghostbusters, lit the Olympic cauldron designed to evoke the sun and a flower representing vitality and hope. Before Friday's opening ceremony, I spoke with a writer Toronto Star subscribers know very well. Very happy to be joined by Bruce Arthur from the Toronto Star on the very first episode of Tokyo Daily. Bruce, you're in Tokyo, so I just got to start with the simple question. What's it been like so far?
Well, I'm in Tokyo, but I'm not like in Tokyo, because part of the reason that when you have a pandemic games, and this makes a lot of sense, we are confined largely to our hotel rooms or the Olympic system. So after the first day of kind of hard quarantine in our rooms, pretty much, then we had the ability to go to the main press center, take a bus there, take a bus back. As of today, we can go other places. So I'll go to the opening ceremony tonight. Tomorrow we'll start going to events. But like even being where we are, you can feel that this could have been one of the great games of all time. This is an incredible city, right? An incredible city with incredible people and incredible culture. And had there not been a pandemic, I mean, there's a lot of things that would happen if there hadn't been a pandemic, but if this was a non-pandemic games, this would have been an incredible celebration of Japan, of sport, of all these things. Like it really could have been great. Now, that said, there are problems even beyond the pandemic with this Olympics. But the pandemic is going to be the dominant theme, is that we are doing this in a country whose cases are doing this, going straight up, not quite straight up, but they're getting there, whose people don't necessarily want us to be here, whose government has a low approval rating. And there was still a chance, at least there was a question earlier this week. Someone asked to the head of the organizing committee, could you still cancel the games? And he didn't rule it out. That's never happened in my lifetime as an Olympic reporter, which goes back to 2008. I don't know that that's ever happened, period. This is a different Olympics.
When I saw the IOC schedule a early morning press conference, the day before or day -1, whichever it was, I wondered if maybe that would be the reason for the calling of the press conference. Has that been kind of your feeling in preparing to travel to Tokyo for these games and having been on the ground for a few days now, that any day you might get that email that these games are done?
I didn't expect it. I've heard it, like it's been whispered around here and there with people with connections to the Olympic movement have said with various levels of confidence this could happen. I never really thought it did, because once you get this something this big in motion, like people who've never covered an Olympics don't understand how complicated this is. Like people who say we should move the Beijing Olympics, morally, yeah, we probably should. Logistically, you might as well move China. It's impossible to do. These things have so many interlocking pieces from athletes and different sports and media and sponsors. And it's 80,000 people in an interlocking system. But that's what makes it so complicated for a pandemic. And that one of the things I wrote about this week is that like a lot of the protocols for this Olympics aren't up to date COVID protocols, right? Like it's plastic dividers between the seats for a disease which is largely transmitted like cigarette smoke, right? That would like it's up in the air. Reporters are jammed together on buses, masked but jammed together. There's going to be a bunch of really strange things about how this works, but there will be outbreaks. We've already had over 100 cases connected to the games, which actually isn't as high as it probably could be with 32,000 people already into the country. And it may not stop. That's the thing, is we have fresh waves of athletes who are going to come in because they're not all in the village at the same time, and you're going to have athletes going out. I think this will just be a drumbeat. The real question is, so now that it's going to happen, like they're not going to cancel it now because Japan is not in dire straits yet. They're headed there, but they're not there yet. And the games are not in complete outbreak panic, but it's on the table that those two things could happen. I think the most likely scenario for Japan is maybe a doubling of the cases, a little more in the next 2 weeks on a daily basis, and that's really bad. And within the system, you could see a crisis. You could see games and athletes get ruled out of the games like during competition. There's a lot of stuff on the table here because, again, you're doing one of the most complicated things that humans do outside of elections and wars, and you're trying to do it with pandemic protocols that probably aren't terribly up to date in a country where it's just complicated. This whole thing's complicated.
Well, you are a legendary Toronto Star sports reporter, and for the last 18 months, you've been covering COVID. Do you feel like you are covering Tokyo 2020 as a sports reporter or as a COVID news reporter?
It's a little bit of both. Doing COVID work for the last year and a half informs me because I have a better grasp of the epidemiology of what a curve looks like, of what kind of all the kind of basics of a pandemic and the subtleties of it a little bit too. Whenever I cover an Olympics, I try to cover the whole thing. Like there's the sports aspect, there's the cultural aspect, there's the political aspect, there's international sport, which at its highest level really has nothing to do with sport. And all of it kind of collides. And that's one of the really fascinating things about Olympics. Like we're going to Beijing in 7 months, right? 7 months away to the Beijing Olympics. And that's going to be as authoritarian Olympics as we've seen since Beijing 2008. And Sochi 2014 is in that conversation as well. There's going to be a lot of parts to this, but you still have to honor the athletes and the sport, because the thing that keeps this thing going, the thing that is the engine of the Olympics, despite all the corruption, all the kind of steamrolling of local interests, all the parts of the games that you don't like, what they're selling is the human spirit, right? They're selling the greatest thing in the world, which is the athletes and what they can do and what they're willing to do. And that stuff, I think, it always carries, right? It always works. This is the one games where I have a little bit of doubt though. Like in Rio, whole thing was going to fall apart, and it nearly did halfway through. The buses almost stopped running. But the athletes, of course, they carried it, right? Sochi was kind of a bit of a moral abomination, hugely corrupt, all kinds of problems with the way Russia treats people. And the athletes carried that. Beijing 2008, again, authoritarian, the athletes carried that. The difference here is that COVID could get the athletes, right? If Simone Biles tests positive, an alternate for the US gymnastics team tested positive the other day. No one else from the team has tested positive yet. But like if Simone Biles tests positive, or Katie Ledecky, or like in Canada, Andre DeGrasse, Penny Oleksiak, like this is absolutely possible. And that's where this is, again, a different games. Almost always the games start with a jumble and it looks like it could be a disaster. And then the athletes save it. This is just a little different dynamic this time.
We've already seen some competitions get underway, softball and when women's soccer, men's soccer has kicked off as well, and seen some surprises and some big upsets, which takes me to my point of competition. Obviously, everything was interrupted. The chaos you've described associated with the games, the chaos and training over a year and change for these athletes in preparing for these COVID Olympics. What do you think the competition will be like across the board?
It's really interesting. Like, so the Canadian Olympic Committee had their press conference this morning, and usually they will set a goal, like top 12, for example, do better than the last Olympics. It's pretty typical. They declined to do it this time. Like they'd love to match Rio when they were a top 12 nation. But they just don't know. Penny Oleksiak, when she swam a really fast 100 free at the Canadian trials, that was her first race in a year and a half. Nobody knew she could do that. Before that race, people within the swimming world were saying Penny Oleksiak is not going to medal at the Olympics. And then she swam the fourth fastest 100 free in the world this year. And the three people ahead of her are Aussies, and only two of them can compete, right? There's going to be, like, Katie Ledecky's Katie Ledecky, Simone Biles is Simone Biles. There's going to be a lot of inevitable champions probably at this Olympics. But the people involved don't know at kind of fundamental levels, because what's happened with the pandemic is it has jumbled the entire sports system, and not just in the obvious way of your pool is closed, your gym is closed, differential COVID restrictions by country. In Canada doesn't come out very well in that because we had such long lockdowns, but anti-doping stopped for a year, right? Like, they've only gotten anti-doping back online in the last several months. It was the Wild West for a year. What happened? And we haven't seen so many of these athletes in substantial competition. So there'll be some stuff that you'll go, yeah, of course that's what happened. And there'll be some stuff that's going to happen where we're going to go, where did that come from?
As a journalist, that must make things very exciting, especially to be on the ground for that. What are maybe one or two things that you're looking forward to, and one or two things you think might surprise you at these games, competition-wise?
Surprise could be really, like, it's really hard to nail that down because there's just so many parts to it. I think Penny Oleksiak's a really interesting story because she's kind of gone off the map and come back on. She said at the trials when she swam that 100 free that it renewed her love of swimming, like nothing less than that. I think that was really interesting. Kylie Mass is a medal contender in swimming. We had a really good games in the pool in Rio, right? Like, Oleksiak alone with 4 medals, like, it was really an impressive performance, the relays and all of that. I'm not sure they can do it this time. The Aussies are, like, a lot stronger than they did. So I think the women, especially in the pool, will be really interesting. When we get to Andre DeGrasse in the second week, but that's like a million years from now. At the Olympics, every day is like a lifetime. So, like, but DeGrasse, it's not clear that he's going to medal, right? Like, the Americans are fast. I'm fascinated by a lot of parts of this thing, but the whole of it still feels so tenuous and weird. It's hard to count on that. Like, Felix Auger-Aliassime, his first singles match is going to be against Andy Murray. He beat Andy Murray last time they played, but that's a wonderful collision of era, of potential greatness versus past greatness. There's going to be all kinds of pieces of that at a games where a lot of professional athletes pulled out. At, like, Naomi Osaka is going to be under an incredible microscope here. That's going to be fascinating. There's just, the thing with this is, the first Summer Games I went to was in Beijing, and I'd never covered any Olympics before. And you get there and you realize it's just, you can't wrap your arms around it. There's just too much happening all the time. And I've gotten better at that over the years, but I still feel like this is going to be a really big, weird, strange, trembling, hopeful Olympics. We're all going to try to get to the end of it, but everything's going to be harder for everyone.
Well, the way you just described that last bit is how a lot of American basketball writers have been talking about Team USA, who on the men's side, who certainly do not look like the dream team that often is sent to the Olympic Games. Quickly, are they as vulnerable as they looked in their tune-ups and their exhibition tilts?
I mean, there's probably another level, but you know, the worst part of that is, imagine if Canada made the games, right? Imagine if the Canadian team had gotten out of the qualifier and the US is not an inevitable force. Now, the Canadian team has some of the same problems in terms of learning to play together and all the fluidity that you get, and you can't just create immediately. But, like, Canada could have been there, man. Like, this USA team has some vulnerabilities with size, so did Canada. They got some vulnerabilities in terms of a pure point guard. They don't really have that. This is going to be really interesting because in my lifetime, again, like, you go back, it's hard to beat the US at any international competition. Argentina is like, that's the mark. Spain has been a great program. Canada could have been there, man. Canada could have been in the mix at these games. And all you can hope for is that for the program is that they come back together and they try again for the next one, and they try again. The women's team, on the other hand, like, the women's team could win a medal here.
Yes.
And that would be an incredible validation of the program. That's what if you're a basketball fan in Canada, that's what you got to focus on.
If not for Thomas Satoransky, the Canadian men could have been in Tokyo. That's it.
Classic Canadian enemy, Thomas Satoransky.
Bruce, I'm very happy that you're in Tokyo, my friend, and that thank you very much for joining us on the first episode of Tokyo Daily.
I will only look worse from here.
Be sure to check out Bruce Arthur's latest piece in the Toronto Star and all of the Toronto Star's Olympic coverage from Tokyo. After drawing the host Japan in their Olympic opener, on Wednesday. The Canadian women's soccer team plays Chile at 3:30 a.m. Eastern on Saturday if you want to wake up for that. That'll be the focus of tomorrow's episode of Tokyo Daily. You can also catch a replay of the opening ceremonies in primetime on CBC if you're in Canada and want to see it Friday night. You can see Tokyo Daily every single day on the Toronto Star's YouTube page. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. I'll talk to you tomorrow.